Forget what you've seen in movies, guys. Tonight's history lesson has too much moaning and too many bodily fluids to be boring. And honestly, a lot less consensual fun than Hollywood ever dares to show. We're ripping open the silk curtains on Roman orgies, not to mention a whole host of other historical perversions, because we're all a little bit twisted, right? Let me know what shocked you most, or if you found any of this disturbing in the way good history should be. When you hear Roman orgy, your mind probably conjures up a scene straight out of a poorly researched epic. Glistening bodies, grapes, toga-clad Romans languidly feeding each other exotic fruits while soft music plays. Sound romantic? It wasn't, not really. Most of what passes for a Roman bacchanal in popular culture is about as accurate as a health seminar taught by a leeching priest. The reality was far more stomach-churning, deeply cynical, and often, frankly, just plain gross. These weren't free love communes. They were calculated displays of power, status, and often, public humiliation designed to reinforce the pecking order. Imagine for a moment being a guest at one of these elite shindigs. You're not there for pleasure, not primarily. You're there to be seen, to network, and most importantly, to endure. The smell alone would hit you first. An intoxicating, nauseating mix of expensive perfumes attempting to mask stale wine, the lingering scent of unwashed bodies, rich food, and the distinct tang of human sweat and vomit. Because, dear reader, Romans were known for their excesses, and moderation was a foreign concept, especially among the patrician class. They didn't just eat until they were full, they ate until they were stuffed, then retired to the vomitorium. A misnomer, by the way, as it wasn't a specific room for puking, but the act itself, often done into a basin or on the floor, so they could return to the feast. Think about that. A communal puke session before the next course. Does that sound like a sensual evening to you? Does that throb of nausea truly set the mood for romance? I doubt it. The food itself was a parade of absurdities, designed to impress rather than nourish. Flamingo tongues, so's udders, dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds. Imagine the texture, the rich, cloying taste, the sheer quantity. Your stomach would be doing acrobatics just watching it. And the wine, copious amounts of it, often mixed with seawater or spices, further dulled the senses and loosened inhibitions, blurring the lines between pleasure and sheer physical discomfort. People would crawl across the floor, half drunk, half sated, fully committed to the spectacle of their own indulgence. This wasn't about erotic exploration. It was about proving you could afford such an absurd, wasteful display. It was about showing you were above the plebeian need for dignity. It was about the power to make others witness your rank excess, to perhaps even participate in your filth. And then there were the entertainments. The true definition of an orgy, in its original Greek sense, was a secret rite or mystery, often associated with Dionysian worship, involving ecstatic ritual. Roman adaptations, however, stripped away the spiritual and ramped up the debauchery. Performers, often enslaved individuals or those of lower social standing, were brought in to dance, sing, or engage in sexual acts for the amusement of the elite. Their bodies were tools, objects to be consumed alongside the food and wine. Their consent was largely irrelevant. Their survival depended on obedience. Imagine being forced to moan for the entertainment of a drunken crowd, to contort your body, to submit to degrading acts, all while maintaining a veneer of subservience. The shame must have been a crushing weight, heavier than any gold chain. The dynamic between the participants was equally squalid. If you were a man of standing, you might bring your wife, who was expected to be a picture of modest beauty and decorum, yet also a subtle participant in the overall erotic atmosphere, careful not to embarrass her husband but also not to appear a prude. Imagine the psychological toll, the constant scrutiny, the forced smiles, the dread of a misplaced glance or an improper word. And if you were a woman, particularly one of means, your presence was a constant negotiation of reputation, often walking a tightrope between being seen as a vibrant hostess and being labeled a common harlot. There was no true liberation in these settings, only different forms of constraint. Your body, your behavior, even your private desires, were all under the cold, calculating eye of Roman society. The sexual freedom of Rome was largely a myth for the majority. For the ruling class, it was less about freedom and more about power and prerogative. Men could indulge in sexual relationships with enslaved people, prostitutes, or lower-class individuals without social penalty, as long as it didn't infringe upon the status of their wives or other elite citizens. For women, however, the rules were far more stringent. Adultery was a serious crime, punishable by exile or even death, particularly if committed by a wife of high status. So, while the men might engage in various liaisons, the women were largely confined to managing the household and producing legitimate heirs, their bodies primarily vessels for procreation and property. The perceived orgiastic nature of Roman society was often a projection of male fantasy onto a complex, hierarchical reality. They might sweat and throb with lust, but the consequences were wildly uneven. Even the famed Roman baths, often depicted as sensual communal spaces, were, at their heart, utilitarian and deeply public. While they offered opportunities for social interaction and occasional trysts, their primary purpose was hygiene and recreation. They were loud, bustling places, often filled with athletes, merchants, and common folk, not just the elite seeking illicit pleasures. Imagine the stench of hundreds of bodies, the noise of splashing and chatter, the grime of daily life. It was a functional space, not a romantic boudoir. Any sexual activity there was more likely opportunistic and transactional than the decadent, free-spirited encounters of legend. This wasn't an invitation to sensual discovery. It was simply another aspect of Roman daily life, imbued with a grimy realism that Hollywood refuses to acknowledge. The whole concept of a bacchanal for the Romans was less about widespread, casual orgies and more about specific religious festivals, often imported from Greek traditions that sometimes did involve ecstatic revelry, including drunkenness and sexual abandon. But even these were often regulated and suppressed by the Roman state if they were perceived as threatening to social order or public morality. When they spiraled out of control, the Senate acted with brutal efficiency. This wasn't some free-for-all. It was a deeply controlled society. Even in its moments of apparent abandon, the power structures remained, always lurking, ready to choke out anything that truly challenged the status quo. The lust was real, the filth was real, but the freedom? That was a luxury afforded only to the most powerful, and even then, often with strings attached, consequences for those below them. So, when you picture that Roman senator casually tossing a grape into the mouth of a half-naked dancer, remember the layers of exploitation, the casual cruelty, and the sheer discomfort that defined so much of Roman elite life. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about performance. It was about proving you had enough power to literally throw your wealth away, to abuse your subordinates, and to stomach the collective effluvia of a decadent, bloated society. The gluttony was a weapon, the perceived promiscuity, a symbol of dominance. There were no heroes in this scene, only powerful abusers and powerless victims. And the punchline? All that excess, all that performative lust, usually ended with a hangover, a stomachache, and the profound, lingering odor of regret and stale wine. Forget the pretty pictures of demure ladies and noble knights. Tonight, we're peeling back the crusty layers of medieval modesty to reveal something far more uncomfortable. We're talking chastity belts. Now, if your brain immediately conjures up a vision of some poor maiden clanking around with an iron contraption between her legs, desperately trying to keep her maidenhead intact while her knight is off crusading, you're not entirely wrong, but you're mostly misinformed. The historical record for widespread use of these delightful devices is sketchier than a monk's doodle of a demon. While some historical accounts mention them, and a few examples exist, they were likely rare, used more for specific circumstances of control, or perhaps as torture devices, than as common marital accessories. But that doesn't mean the concept of controlling female sexuality wasn't profoundly, brutally real. It was. It just didn't always involve a giant metal padlock. The absurdity of it all lies in the underlying premise that a woman's chastity was a tangible, stealable commodity, something to be physically locked away, like a jewel. Her hymen was a property deed, proving ownership and legitimacy, ensuring that any offspring were undeniably of the correct lineage. This was a world obsessed with inheritance, with bloodlines, with ensuring that the male heir receiving the family fortune was, indeed, his father's son. Imagine the pressure, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being little more than a biological vault. Your body wasn't your own. It was a vessel for purity, a guarantee of legitimate progeny. This was a suffocating reality for women, especially noble women, whose wombs were quite literally political instruments. The throb of desire, the natural urges, were to be suppressed, denied, or meticulously channeled. The marital rite was a legal and social construct that truly spiraled downward into bodily detail and emotional consequences. A husband had a right to his wife's body, and she, theoretically, to his, but the power dynamic was rarely balanced. For a wife, refusal could be seen as disobedience, even a form of rebellion. Her body was a duty, a means to an end. Procreation, yes, but also a mechanism for maintaining social order. Think about the physical discomfort, the lack of privacy, the sheer transactional nature of intimacy, in a society where pleasure was often viewed with suspicion, and the act itself was primarily about lineage and control. Imagine the smell of unwashed linen, the damp chill of a medieval bedchamber, the rough texture of coarse wool, and the forced embrace. There was little tenderness, only the cold mechanics of duty. And let's be graphic for a moment. If chastity belts were real and commonly used, think about the practicalities, the chafing, the inevitable sores, the infections, in an era before even basic hygiene was understood, the sheer, relentless discomfort, the daily smear of sweat, and perhaps worse, trapped against the skin, the constant vigilance required to maintain such a device. This wasn't some fantasy of denial. It was a grim reality of pain and potential disease. It evokes a crawl of disgust, a feeling of being trapped not just by iron, but by the very idea of male ownership. The thought makes one choke on the hypocrisy of an age that claimed piety while inflicting such indignities. The true chastity belt of the Middle Ages was often societal pressure, religious doctrine, and economic dependence. Women had few options outside of marriage or the convent. Marriage was a necessity for survival, a social contract often negotiated by families for land, wealth, or alliances. Within this framework, a woman's sexual purity before marriage was paramount, and her fidelity within marriage was non-negotiable. The scandal of a tarnished reputation could ruin an entire family. This created a climate of fear, where whispers could destroy lives, and suspicion could lead to brutal accusations, especially in smaller, isolated communities where everyone knew everyone's business. The shame of being publicly exposed for sexual transgression could be a death sentence, social or literal. The obsession with virginity wasn't just about inheritance. It was about theological purity. The Church, with its profound influence, often preached the sanctity of virginity and the dangers of carnal lust. While marriage was sanctioned for procreation, sex for pleasure was often condemned. This created an immense tension between natural human urges and severe religious injunctions. Confessors, those leeching priests, often probed deeply into the sexual lives of their parishioners, eliciting details that today would be considered a gross invasion of privacy. Imagine confessing your desires, your secret moments of pleasure, to a man who holds your eternal soul in his judgmental hands. The pressure to conform, to deny one's own body, to live in constant fear of spiritual damnation, was a powerful, unseen cage. Even for the men, this wasn't always a free ride. While their transgressions were often tolerated or ignored, especially if they were powerful, there were still expectations. They were meant to uphold the social order, to protect their wives' honor, which was, again, their property, and to produce legitimate heirs. The sexual landscape was not one of liberation, but of rigid boundaries and unyielding expectations, where every act of lust had a potential consequence, social or spiritual. The rank hypocrisy of men demanding absolute fidelity from their wives, while indulging in their own secret vices, was a constant undercurrent. The narrative of courtly love that we often associate with the Middle Ages provides a stark contrast, almost a mockery of this reality. Knights supposedly pining for unattainable ladies, engaging in platonic adoration. While romanticized, this ideal often served to channel male desire away from wives, who were property, towards other women who were often already married and therefore also property, creating a bizarre, frustrating sexual dance. It was a fantasy, a polite fiction that allowed for the exploration of desire without truly challenging the strictures of marriage and ownership. No dirty peasant was going to write a sonnet about his mistress. This was a game for the elite, and it had its own cruel rules. The bleak punchline of all this? The medieval obsession with female purity, whether enforced by mythical chastity belts or very real social and religious pressure, wasn't about protecting women. It was about controlling them. It was about defining their worth by their reproductive capacity and their obedience. It was about ownership, plain and simple. And the actual physical reality of life, with its lack of hygiene, its omnipresent disease, its grinding poverty, made any idealized notion of pure, clean bodies a complete absurdity. The purity was a concept, a legal fiction, not a physical reality. It was a suffocating blanket woven from shame and expectation, leaving those caught beneath it to throb with suppressed desires and quiet resentment, often until the grave. Control isn't love, it's just control. And in the Middle Ages, it was a particularly ugly, uncomfortable brand of it. All right, history fiends. Tonight, we're stepping into the shimmering, disease-ridden world of the Renaissance courtesan. Forget the romanticized image you've seen in lavish period dramas. The intelligent, independent woman, dressed in silks, holding court with princes and artists. That's like saying a modern-day influencer is just like a Renaissance queen. Sure, some made a name for themselves, but beneath the veneer of cultured charm and expensive lace often lay a grim reality. We're going to spiral downward into the oozing heart of a trade that was as much about survival as it was about pleasure. And it had a particularly gruesome travel companion, syphilis. Imagine, for a moment, being a woman in Renaissance Italy, particularly one who possessed beauty, wit, but perhaps lacked the dowry or noble birth to secure a respectable marriage. Your options were brutal: convent, marriage, often to an older, unappealing man for political or financial gain, or the precarious, dangerous life of a cortegiana onesta, the honest courtesan. Honest, in this context, meant they were distinct from common prostitutes, supposedly offering companionship, intellectual conversation, and artistic patronage alongside their sexual services. But let's be blunt. It was still a transaction, and the stakes were astronomically high. Your body was your capital, your intellect a tool to elevate your price, and your future was always, always uncertain. The throb of ambition often masked the constant, gnawing fear of ruin. The absurdity of the situation lay in the hypocrisy of the era. On one hand, society celebrated beauty, art, and intellectual prowess. On the other, it relegated women who embodied these qualities, especially if they weren't safely married, to the fringes of respectability. Courtesans were sought after by the most powerful men: popes, cardinals, dukes, and merchants. Men who preached piety and condemned lust, but indulged in it nonetheless. Their palaces were often dens of exquisite filth. The very men who enjoyed their company were often the ones who would shame them publicly, condemn them religiously, or abandon them financially once their youth or beauty faded. This was a game of power, where women were constantly navigating treacherous waters, their very existence a silent, provocative challenge to societal norms, yet utterly dependent on them. And then, the elephant in the brothel: syphilis. It arrived in Europe in the late 15th century, a terrifying, sexually transmitted plague that decimated populations and left its victims disfigured, mad, and eventually dead. Courtesans, by the very nature of their profession, were at the absolute forefront of this epidemic. Imagine the terror of feeling the first symptoms: the mysterious sores, the aching joints, the hair loss, the growing lesions that could appear anywhere on the body, especially on the face. The smell of decay, of festering wounds, would have been a constant companion for many. Medical treatment was primitive and often worse than the disease itself. Mercury rubs, which caused agonizing pain, tooth loss, and neurological damage, or herbal remedies that were largely ineffective. Your body, once your greatest asset, would slowly, agonizingly betray you, turning into a public spectacle of oozing decay. The stories of courtesans like Veronica Franco in Venice or Imperia Cognati in Rome paint a picture of women who, despite their precarious position, carved out spaces of influence and relative autonomy. They dressed in lavish silks, adorned themselves with jewels, commissioned portraits, and engaged in witty banter with the elite. But beneath the expensive fabrics and the painted smiles, there was the constant threat of disease, destitution, and social ostracization. One misstep, one wealthy patron's whim, one bout of illness, and your carefully constructed world could crumble. The smear of suspicion was always there, clinging to their names. Consider the practicalities, the constant negotiation for payment, for gifts, for protection, the careful management of relationships with multiple patrons, playing them off against each other to secure better terms. The pressure to maintain a youthful appearance, to be perpetually desirable, even as time and disease waged a relentless war on your flesh. The loneliness of a life where true intimacy was rare, and every interaction was tinged with transaction. The throb of a headache, the burning pain of a new lesion, the chilling realization that your body was quite literally rotting away from within. The psychological toll of living a life that was both admired and condemned must have been immense. The power dynamics were brutally clear. These women, despite their apparent influence, were still ultimately dependent on male patronage. They could command high prices, but they couldn't vote, couldn't own property outright, and couldn't escape the societal judgment that branded them fallen women. They were commodities, albeit highly prized ones, their agency existing only within the narrow confines of their profession. A patron could choke off their income at any moment, leaving them to crawl back into destitution or worse. The concept of respect was a fluid thing, granted and withdrawn at the whim of powerful men. The ironic punchline here is that the very same men who engaged the services of these women were often the ones who condemned them, publicly upholding a facade of moral purity while secretly indulging in the filth. The wealth accumulated through their services often went to support their families or secure a retirement, if they were lucky enough to survive the onslaught of disease and despair. But many were not. Many ended their lives in poverty, disfigured, and alone, their beauty and wit consumed by the very society that had so eagerly exploited them. Their laughter, their intellectual prowess, their very existence became a haunting testament to the hypocrisy of the age. Beauty fades, but venereal disease, it turns out, is forever. And the shame of a woman's body used for pleasure was far more enduring than the momentary thrill of her patrons. It was a bleak reflection on a beautiful yet brutal era. All right, buckle up, because we're about to tear open the tight corset of Victorian prudery and expose the festering, hidden filth that lay beneath. Forget the image of corseted ladies fainting on settees and gentlemen with impeccable manners. That was the carefully constructed stage set. Behind the drawn curtains, in the gaslit alleys and opulent drawing rooms, the Victorian era was a seething cauldron of repression, hypocrisy, and frankly, some of the most bizarre and brutal sexual fixations history has ever produced. This wasn't about prim and proper. It was about keeping up appearances while indulging in every conceivable perversion, often at the expense of the most vulnerable. The absurdity of the Victorian age lies in its militant moralism. They codified modesty, demonized lust, and wrapped the female form in layers of restrictive clothing, convinced they could legislate human desire out of existence. Meanwhile, London, Paris, and New York teemed with brothels catering to every taste, from the common streetwalker to elaborate, fancy houses offering specialized services. The demand for prostitutes was rampant, a stark contradiction to the public pronouncements of piety. Imagine the sheer hypocrisy. A society that preached about purity while generating an enormous, unspoken industry of sexual exploitation. The air was thick with unspoken desires, a perpetual throb of repressed lust that found its outlet in the shadows. Let's spiral downward into the gritty, bodily details. While respectable women wore corsets that constricted their waists to unnatural degrees, sometimes causing internal organ damage, forcing them to take shallow breaths and even faint, a whole other economy of bodies existed. Back alley abortionists, often using crude, dangerous instruments, were a desperate last resort for women facing ruin. Venereal diseases, like gonorrhea and syphilis, still rampant, often undiagnosed, were a constant, painful threat, silently gnawing away at bodies and minds, their sufferers often too ashamed to seek proper treatment. Imagine the ooze, the stench, the raw pain, all hidden beneath a veneer of starched collars and silk dresses. It makes you want to crawl out of your skin just thinking about it. The power games at play were utterly brutal. The class divide was a chasm. While wealthy men could visit brothels with impunity, their wives were expected to remain chaste, their reputations sacrosanct. The fallen woman, the prostitute, the unwed mother was ostracized, condemned to a life of poverty and shame. She became society's refuse, a stark warning to other women who might dare to stray. Meanwhile, her male clients, often pillars of the community, faced no such public degradation. This was a system designed to maintain male dominance and control, where female bodies were commodities, and female sexuality was a dangerous force to be policed, contained, or exploited. The words filth and rank truly apply here, not just to the physical conditions, but to the moral decay. And the depravities weren't limited to prostitution. The Victorian era saw the rise of a particular obsession with hysteria in women, a catch-all diagnosis for any female ailment, emotional distress, or even sexual desire that didn't fit patriarchal norms. Treatments ranged from forced bed rest and isolation to bizarre, often sexually invasive procedures performed by male doctors who viewed female anatomy with a mix of fascination and fear. Imagine being a woman, feeling genuine distress, only to be told your uterus is wandering, or that you need a pelvic massage to relieve your hysteria, often performed by a man. The sheer humiliation, the violation, the silent suffering must have been unbearable. It was intimacy, as control taken to a truly grotesque level. Child exploitation was also tragically widespread. Poverty forced many children, particularly girls, into the streets, where they were vulnerable to sexual predators. The infamous case of William T. Stead's maiden tribute of modern Babylon expose revealed the horrifying reality of young girls being sold into prostitution in London, often with the complicity of their own desperate parents or corrupt intermediaries. The casual cruelty of this trade, the shattered innocence, the life sentences of trauma and degradation, cast a dark shadow over the proper Victorian world. It makes you want to choke on the injustice, to scream at the sheer volume of human misery hidden beneath that veneer of respectability. Even within respectable marriages, intimacy was often a transactional duty, especially for women. The concept of female pleasure was often denied or ignored, replaced by the expectation of dutiful procreation. Sexual desire was a male prerogative, a dangerous, barely tolerated necessity for women. The marriage bed was often a place of quiet endurance for women, their moans perhaps stifled, their bodies offered out of obligation, not passion. The psychological consequences of this repression were immense, leading to widespread neuroses, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of unfulfillment. It was a bleak existence, where genuine connection was often sacrificed at the altar of societal norms. The very language of the time reveals this discomfort. Even legs were often referred to as limbs in polite company. Pianos were dressed in trousers to prevent any scandalous suggestion of their legs. This desperate attempt to sanitize public discourse only made the inevitable transgression seem more shocking, more thrilling, more illicit. The greater the public repression, the wilder the secret indulgence. It created a paradoxical dynamic, where the desire for purity inadvertently fueled a thriving subculture of depravity and perversion. The very effort to keep things clean only amplified the perceived filth. The bleak punchline of the Victorian age is this: the dirtiest secrets are often found under the cleanest linens. Their attempts to construct a flawless, morally upright society only pushed the very human urges they condemned deeper into the shadows, where they festered and mutated into darker, more exploitative forms. The polite smiles masked shattered lives, the rigid moral codes concealed rampant abuse, and the pursuit of purity bred an astonishing amount of filth. There were no heroes here, only cycles of lust, power, and punishment, all cloaked in a thick fog of hypocrisy. It was a society that celebrated its own veneer of virtue, while quite literally drowning in its own hidden depravities. a stark reminder that what's hidden often hurts the most. Hold on to your historical misconceptions, because we're plunging headfirst into ancient Egypt, a land of pyramids, mummies, and an uncomfortable amount of royal incest. Forget the romanticized images of Cleopatra or Nefertiti as timeless beauties. While they certainly had power, the reality of maintaining their divine bloodlines often involved some profoundly questionable bedroom practices, making the phrase family values take on a truly absurd, utterly disturbing meaning. This wasn't some fleeting dalliance. It was a core tenet of their pharaonic power structure, spiraling downward into bodily realities that would make your stomach churn. The absurdity begins with the concept of divine lineage. Pharaohs were considered gods on earth, direct descendants of Ra or Osiris. To maintain this sacred connection, to keep the blood pure and powerful, they frequently married within their immediate families. We're talking brother-sister marriages, sometimes even father-daughter or mother-son. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a coldly calculated political and religious maneuver, designed to preserve the power of the ruling dynasty, and to ensure that only the most pure blood sat on the throne. The throb of royal authority was inextricably linked to this genetic roulette. Now, let's get graphic. While ancient Egyptians had advanced medical knowledge for their time, they certainly didn't understand genetics. The repeated inbreeding of pharaonic families led to a litany of physical deformities and illnesses. Think of Tutankhamun, the boy king, whose recent DNA analysis suggests he suffered from numerous congenital defects, including a clubfoot, a curved spine, and a debilitating bone disease likely due to his parents being full siblings. Imagine the physical pain, the constant discomfort, the visible signs of decay in a body meant to embody divine perfection. The smear of disease was quite literal. The royal household was a gilded cage of power games and forced intimacy. Sisters were raised to become wives, daughters groomed for politically expedient unions with their own fathers. Their bodies were not their own. They were vessels for the continuation of a divine dynasty. The pressure to produce healthy heirs, to carry on the sacred lineage, must have been immense, particularly when the genetic dice were so heavily loaded against them. The concept of consent in such a context was utterly alien. You were born into a role, and your body was simply a tool for its fulfillment. The shame of perceived failure, of not producing the right heir, would have been a crushing weight. Beyond the royal family, fertility cults were a pervasive part of Egyptian life, intrinsically linked to the cycles of the Nile and the bounty of the harvest. Rituals often involved explicit sexual imagery, phallic symbols, and sometimes even ritualized intercourse or offerings of bodily fluids to ensure the land's fertility. Imagine the scenes, the blend of the sacred and the overtly carnal, the communal participation in acts meant to invoke divine blessing. This wasn't necessarily about individual pleasure, but about a collective desperation for survival, for the crops to grow, for the Nile to flood. It was a primal connection to the land, expressed through raw, unbridled sexuality. The moan of a ritual chant blending with something far more primal. The power of the pharaoh, and by extension, the religious authority that legitimized his incestuous unions, was absolute. To question the king was to question the gods themselves. This created a climate where dissent was unthinkable, and even the most bizarre practices were accepted as divine will. The sheer volume of wealth and power wielded by the pharaonic court made them untouchable, allowing them to indulge in practices that would be considered monstrous in any other context. The crawl of absolute power, unchecked, slithering into the most intimate parts of life. The lives of these royal women, particularly those forced into incestuous marriages, were often profoundly isolated. They were goddesses, yes, but also prisoners of their own divinity. Their existence revolved around royal protocol, religious ceremony, and the intense pressure to procreate. There was little room for personal desire, for genuine connection, or for an escape from the relentless scrutiny of the court. Their bodies, though adorned with lavish jewels and fine linens, were essentially biological machines for the propagation of power. The very concept of a family, as we understand it, was warped beyond recognition at the highest echelons of Egyptian society. The lines between siblings, spouses, and parents were blurred, often non-existent in the pursuit of maintaining a pure bloodline. This wasn't about love or companionship. It was about political stability and religious justification. The emotional consequences for those involved, the deep psychological impact of such forced intimacy, remains largely unexplored in historical texts, but one can only imagine the bleakness. The bleak punchline? All that divine power, all that gold and grandeur, ultimately couldn't protect them from the harsh realities of biology. Despite their status as living gods, the pharaohs and their queens were still flesh and blood, susceptible to the same genetic laws that govern mere mortals. Their attempts to transcend humanity through inbreeding only brought them closer to its limitations, resulting in a legacy of physical suffering and genetic compromise. Sometimes, divine power just means a lot of bad genes, and a whole lot of unspoken agony behind the gold masks. It's a chilling reminder that even the most powerful cannot escape the messy, grotesque realities of the body. Alright, tonight we're taking a stroll through the elegant, meticulously constructed world of the Japanese geisha. But before you get lost in visions of delicate dances and poetic whispers, let's dismantle the popular Western fantasy. Geisha were not prostitutes. Yet the historical reality is far more nuanced, riddled with shadows, and often involved a chilling proximity to sexual exploitation, making the illusion of intimacy both a beautiful art form and a profound tragedy. It's a story where beauty became a gilded cage, and performance was a full-time job that often masked a constant bleed of personal autonomy. The absurdity of the geisha's existence lies in this delicate paradox. They were highly skilled entertainers, trained in traditional arts like music, dance, and conversation, renowned for their beauty and wit. They were cultural icons, epitomes of refinement. Yet, their world was built on male patronage and the commodification of female charm and companionship. While a true geisha did not sell her body, the boundaries between her profession and the pleasure quarters, where courtesans and prostitutes operated, were fluid, especially in the early stages of her career, or if she fell into financial hardship. Imagine the daily tightrope walk, the constant negotiation of boundaries, the pressure to be desirable without being explicit, the throb of desire from their patrons, and the careful deflection of it was a constant performance. Let's spiral downward into the physical and emotional details. The life of a geisha was one of immense discipline and physical discomfort. Their elaborate kimonos, though beautiful, were restrictive and heavy. Their iconic white makeup, applied painstakingly, was a literal mask covering their true expressions. The traditional hairstyles, often requiring a wooden pillow to sleep on, were agonizing and could lead to bald spots. Imagine the hours of practice, the strict diets, the constant physical adjustments to maintain an ethereal grace, all while feeling the burn of fatigue and the ache of discipline. Every movement, every gesture, every silent moan of discomfort was part of the performance. The power games within the geisha world were subtle yet absolute. An okasan, mother of the geisha house, held immense power, controlling the training, debts, and careers of her geisha. Girls, often from impoverished families, were sometimes sold into these houses at a young age, incurring debts that tied them to the okasan for years, if not decades. This created a system of economic bondage, where a geisha's freedom was largely contingent on her ability to earn money and pay off her substantial training costs. Her body, her talents, her very life were assets to be managed by the house. The smear of economic desperation was never far. A common practice, particularly in earlier periods, was mizuage, a ceremony marking a maiko, apprentice geisha, coming of age, sometimes involving the auctioning of her virginity to a wealthy patron, dana. While this practice was largely outlawed in the modern era, its historical existence highlights the complex, often exploitative relationship between the art and the physical reality of female bodies in this world. This was not a choice for pleasure. It was a transactional rite of passage, a significant payment that benefited the geisha house and established a patron. The emotional consequences, the potential for trauma, the silent resignation must have been profound. It was intimacy as control, utterly devoid of genuine connection. The relationship with a dana, patron, was another layer of complex power dynamics. While a dana, provided financial support, and often took on the role of a mentor or protector. He also exerted significant influence over the geisha's life and career. He wasn't a husband, but his expectations and desires often shaped her daily existence. The struggle for agency within these relationships was constant. To maintain popularity and financial stability, a geisha had to be perpetually charming, available for entertainment, and skilled at creating an illusion of intimacy without true attachment. The loneliness of such a life, where every interaction was a performance, must have been immense. The strict social hierarchy within the geisha world itself was another form of control. The most successful and sought-after geisha commanded respect, but others struggled, constantly battling for opportunities, reputation, and patronage. Competition was fierce, and a slip in performance, an aging appearance, or a perceived scandal could ruin a career. The fear of failure, of being cast aside, of having to crawl into less respectable forms of labor, was a constant undercurrent. The emotional journey of a geisha often involved a profound detachment from her own desires and emotions. She was trained to embody an ideal, to project an image of serene beauty and effortless charm, regardless of her inner state. Her job was to provide pleasure and escape for her clients, to be a living work of art. This required a deep level of self-control, a suppression of personal needs, and a constant dedication to the performance. The internal conflict, the silent suffering, the yearning for genuine connection that might never come, painted a bleak picture beneath the elaborate facade. The bleak punchline of the geisha's world? Beauty can be a gilded cage, and performance is a full-time job. But it's still a job. For all the artistry, the culture, the grace, the underlying reality for many geisha was one of economic dependency, subtle exploitation, and profound emotional isolation. Their lives were meticulously crafted illusions, designed to provide pleasure and escape for others, while their own desires, their own bodies, were often just tools in a complex, often brutal, transactional world. There were no grand heroics, only the quiet perseverance of women navigating a system that valued their allure more than their autonomy. The throb of unspoken desires, the constant strain of performance, and the pervasive reality of power over purity shaped their world. All right, history buffs, forget the Roman orgies we busted earlier. Tonight, we're plunging into the really dark, really messy, and utterly tyrannical depths of Roman emperors. You think Caligula and Nero were just caricatures? You're in for a truly disgusting surprise. Their reigns weren't just about lavish parties. They were about unchecked power spiraling into grotesque sexual depravity, sadism, and a chilling disregard for human dignity. This wasn't romance, folks. This was a power game where sex was a weapon, and the consequences for those caught in its crosshairs were often horrifying, leaving a smear of terror and humiliation across the annals of time. The absurdity of emperors like Caligula or Nero lay in their absolute power, which quickly devolved into a profoundly disturbed form of megalomania. They weren't just leaders, they were gods on earth, exempt from mortal laws, free to indulge every whim, no matter how perverse. Imagine waking up knowing your life, your body, your very existence, depended entirely on the fleeting mood of a man who might declare his horse a consul one day and order you to be executed the next. The constant throb of fear must have been unbearable for anyone in their orbit. Let's get graphic. Caligula, for instance, reportedly engaged in incestuous relationships with his sisters, publicly, as a display of his divine right and contempt for Roman morality. He was said to force senators to attend his orgies, making them witness his sexual acts, even forcing them to participate in degrading rituals. His debaucheries included transforming his palace into a brothel, forcing noble women and men of high standing to prostitute themselves for his amusement. Imagine the psychological torment, the utter violation, the public exposure of one's family to such filth. Their shame was his entertainment, a cruel joke played on the elite. Nero, not to be outdone, engaged in his own brand of depravity. He was rumored to castrate a young boy, Sporus, and marry him in a public ceremony, treating him as his wife. He also reportedly staged elaborate, cruel games, where he, disguised as an animal, would attack bound victims, both male and female, before sexually assaulting them. The Golden House he built after the Great Fire of Rome was said to have rooms designed for debauchery, where elaborate feasts and orgies took place, involving forced participation and humiliating acts. The sheer volume of cruelty, the deliberate degradation, makes you want to choke. The power games here were explicit and brutal. These emperors used sexual acts as a means of control, to test loyalty, to humiliate rivals, and to demonstrate their absolute dominion. To refuse an emperor's demand, no matter how degrading, was to invite immediate and often gruesome death. This wasn't about lust for pleasure. It was lust for power, expressed through the complete subjugation of others. Their victims were reduced to objects, their bodies mere instruments for the emperor's twisted desires. The physical and emotional consequences for those trapped in this nightmare were catastrophic. Public shaming, physical mutilation, madness, and ultimately, death. The sensory overload of these emperors' courts would have been a bizarre mix of extreme luxury and extreme depravity. Fine perfumes, trying to mask the scent of stale bodily fluids, the sounds of music mingling with moans of forced submission, the sight of opulent fabrics draped over scenes of utter degradation. The very air must have crawled with a sense of dread, the constant anticipation of the next bizarre whim. There were no safe spaces, no private moments when an emperor like Caligula or Nero was on one of his terrifying rampages. The psychological impact on the perpetrators themselves is equally bleak. Caligula was believed to be genuinely mad, his cruelty escalating throughout his short reign. Nero's later years were marked by paranoia and an increasing detachment from reality. Their unchecked power created a feedback loop of depravity, where every monstrous act only emboldened them to commit more. There was no growth arc for these characters, only an escalating descent into the abyss of their own pathology. Their intimacy was always about control, about reducing others to nothingness. The people around them, from the highest senators to the lowliest slaves, were forced into survival mode, often having to compromise their own dignity to simply stay alive. They became complicit in the emperor's crimes, or at least silent witnesses, their souls slowly corroding under the constant pressure. The resolution of these conflicts was rarely satisfying. It was typically the emperor's eventual assassination, which brought temporary relief, but never truly erased the horrific legacy of their actions. The casual references to abuse, hierarchy, and religious hypocrisy are everywhere. These emperors, despite their divine status, were deeply flawed, violent men whose personal pathologies were amplified by their unlimited authority. Their actions shattered social norms, corrupted institutions, and left a lasting stain on Roman history. The myth-puncturing micro-cliffhangers here aren't about what happened next, but how much worse it could get, and often did. The bleak punchline of these imperial reigns? Absolute power doesn't corrupt absolutely. It just reveals how utterly depraved some people always were, given the chance. The Roman Empire, for all its glory, also harbored some of history's most chilling examples of how raw, unchecked power can turn human beings into monsters, transforming pleasure into torment, and reducing life to a continuous cycle of lust, power, and punishment. There were no heroes to be found in the imperial bedrooms, only victims and the brutal, oozing expressions of pure, unadulterated tyranny. All right, tonight we're getting uncomfortably close to God, or, more accurately, to the utterly unholy truths festering behind the pious facades of medieval monasteries. Forget the serene images of robed monks silently transcribing texts or meditating in peaceful cloisters. That's a PR spin. The reality, as any true cynic knows, is that where you find humans, you find sin, and where you find unchecked power and forced celibacy, you often find a special, potent brew of hypocrisy and hidden filth. These supposedly sacred spaces could become dens of quiet vice, transforming spiritual devotion into a desperate, often disgusting battle against the flesh. The absurdity of the monastic ideal was its demand for absolute celibacy. In a world saturated with human desire, these institutions claim to elevate individuals above the carnal, forcing them into lives devoid of physical intimacy. Imagine the constant internal struggle, the gnawing hunger, the suppressed urges that throbbed beneath the rough wool habits. For many, The call to God was genuine, but for others, the monastery offered a refuge from a brutal world, a place for intellectual pursuits, or even a convenient dumping ground for unwanted children of noble families. Not everyone who entered was a saint in training, and human nature, it turns out, is incredibly resilient in finding loopholes. Let's spiral downward into the bodily details, because medieval hygiene, even in a monastery, was rarely pristine. Imagine the smell of damp stone, stale incense, and unwashed bodies, particularly in crowded dormitories. Monks and nuns, though often committed to cleanliness of spirit, weren't always exemplars of bodily purity. Louse infestations were common, and the constant itch would have been a physical manifestation of discomfort. Penance often involved self-flagellation, leaving welts and bleeding wounds, physical pain inflicted in the name of spiritual cleansing. But beneath this overt suffering, secrets festered. The power games within the cloister were intricate and often brutal. Abbots and abbesses wielded immense authority over their charges, controlling every aspect of their lives, from what they ate to whom they spoke. The confessional, intended as a conduit for spiritual absolution, could easily become an instrument of control, with leeching priests extracting intimate details that could be used for manipulation or blackmail. Imagine revealing your deepest, most shameful lusts or doubts to a man who holds your very soul in his hands, knowing he could use that information to condemn you. The shame of being exposed, of having one's spiritual weakness laid bare, was a crushing burden, and sex, despite the vows, inevitably found its way in. Accounts of monastic life, even from within the church, reveal widespread problems with fornication, sodomy, and illicit liaisons. These were often hidden, clandestine affairs, conducted in the dead of night, in forgotten corners of the monastery, or with discreet visitors. Imagine the furtive glances, the whispered assignations, the terrifying thrill of forbidden touch, knowing that discovery could mean severe penance, public humiliation, or even excommunication, and a brutal expulsion back into a world they were no longer equipped to navigate. The silence of the cloister, far from being a sign of piety, often served as a perfect cover for a multitude of sins. The moan of suppressed desire, suddenly released, echoing in the quiet. The hierarchy extended to the very food and drink. While some orders lived in extreme austerity, others, particularly wealthier ones, indulged in surprisingly rich diets and copious amounts of wine and ale. This consumption could lead to drunkenness, further loosening inhibitions and facilitating illicit encounters. The contrast between the stated ideals of asceticism and the reality of physical indulgence created a profound hypocrisy that permeated monastic life. The filth wasn't just physical, it was moral and spiritual, a pervasive smear on the divine ideal. The psychological toll on those who chafed under the restrictions, or who succumbed to temptation, must have been immense. Guilt, spiritual torment, the constant fear of damnation, the profound loneliness of living a shawl, this festered in the quiet halls. Some monks and nuns found release in illicit relationships, others in obsessive piety, and still others descended into despair or madness. There were no hero arcs here, only the grim reality of human nature struggling against impossible demands. The survival through silence was a brutal necessity. The concept of religious hypocrisy wasn't just an occasional failing, it was often systemic. The church, while demanding celibacy from its clergy, often turned a blind eye to widespread abuses, or dealt with them in secrecy to protect its own reputation. The scandal of a priest with a mistress, or a nun with a child, was often swept under the rug, the victims silenced, the perpetrators merely reassigned. This casual reference to abuse was built into the very structure, a tacit acknowledgement that the rules were often for show. The bleak punchline of medieval monasteries? God sees all, yes, but medieval stone walls were surprisingly effective at hiding the nastier bits. The pursuit of spiritual purity often created conditions ripe for human depravity, turning places of supposed sanctity into arenas for lust, power games, and silent suffering. The throb of human desire, forever denied, found its grotesque payoffs in hidden corners and forbidden embraces. It's a chilling reminder that human nature, in its complexity, will always find a way to express itself, even under the strictest of vows. leaving behind a legacy of shame, guilt, and the pervasive smell of secrets. Tonight, my historically inclined perverts, we're venturing into a place that Hollywood loves to glamorize but rarely gets right: the Ottoman harem. Forget the shimmering silk fantasies of enslaved beauties lounging around, waiting for the Sultan's pleasure. That's about as accurate as a medieval health guide. The reality of the imperial harem was far more complex, politically charged, and frankly, terrifying. It was a golden cage, yes, but one teeming with intrigue, fear, and a cutthroat power struggle where eunuchs wielded immense influence, and a woman's survival depended on her cunning and her ability to navigate a system designed to control her every breath, making power games and silent screams a daily routine. The absurdity of the harem lay in its very structure. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women, all living in close proximity, all ostensibly for the pleasure of one man, the Sultan. Yet, for most of these women, their primary purpose was not sexual. Many were servants, seamstresses, musicians, or concubines, who might never even meet the Sultan. They were all part of a rigidly hierarchical household, a meticulously controlled environment designed to produce heirs, secure political alliances, and maintain the illusion of absolute male dominance. Imagine the constant surveillance, the whispering jealousies, the pervasive fear of being forgotten, or worse, of being discarded. The throb of anxiety was a constant companion. Let's spiral downward into the bodily details. The harem was a microcosm of society, filled with the everyday sounds and smells of hundreds of women, perfumed baths, elaborate clothing, the clatter of jewelry, but also the inevitable human realities: the daily struggle for personal space, the constant pressure to look perfect, the physical toll of competing for the Sultan's attention, or simply for a better position within the hierarchy. Hygiene was meticulous, but the emotional strain was relentless. Every woman's body was a potential political tool, a vessel for royal progeny, or a weapon in the hands of rival factions. The smear of competition was everywhere, etched on every face. The power games were intricate and deadly. At the very top, beneath the Sultan, reigned the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was often the most powerful woman in the empire, wielding immense influence through her son. Below her were the Kadınlar, chief concubines, the mothers of the Sultan's children, vying to produce the next heir. Then came the Iqbal, favored ones, and the Guzdeler, favorites, and a vast array of other concubines, servants, and slaves. Every woman had a place, and every place was a precarious perch from which to fall. Promotions could lead to immense wealth and power. Demotions could mean banishment or even death. And then there were the eunuchs. These castrated men, often taken from conquered lands or sold into slavery as children, served as the harem's guardians and administrators. They were the silent sentinels, the Sultan's eyes and ears within the women's quarters, but they also wielded immense power. They controlled access, managed finances, and acted as intermediaries between the harem and the outside world. Their physical sacrifice granted them a unique position of trust, making them both feared and indispensable. Imagine being a young woman, surrounded by these silent, watchful figures, knowing they controlled your every movement, your every chance at advancement. Their presence was a constant reminder of the intense control. The intimacy as control aspect was profoundly present. For the Sultan, his interactions with the concubines were not just about pleasure. They were about asserting dominance, about exercising his absolute right to their bodies. For the women, sexual encounters with the Sultan were opportunities, chances to gain favor, to conceive a son, and thus to elevate their status and secure their future. There was little room for genuine affection in this transactional environment. Every moan, every touch, was fraught with political implications. The sheer volume of human bodies, all confined within the harem walls, created intense emotional triggers. Jealousy, ambition, despair, and fear were rampant. A woman might spend years in the harem, never once catching the Sultan's eye, her life a quiet descent into obscurity. Others might rise quickly, only to fall just as fast, victims of rivalries or the Sultan's fickle attention. Survival often meant silence, cunning, and a ruthless pragmatism, crushing any lingering romantic notions of love or freedom. The exploitation was rampant. a constant undercurrent. The harem was also a place of immense wealth and luxury, but it was a gilded cage nonetheless. The women were provided with the finest clothing, food, and education, but they were still prisoners. Their movements restricted, their lives dictated by the whims of the sultan and the rigid rules of the court. Their beauty was their currency, and their bodies were their means to an end. It was a bleak existence for many, their lives a perpetual struggle for relevance and survival in a system designed to keep them dependent. The narrative architecture here spirals downward into the raw human emotions of confinement and desperation. There were no traditional hero arcs, only the relentless cycle of power, lust, and punishment within a tightly controlled ecosystem. The sexual horror wasn't necessarily graphic violence, but the systemic objectification and the psychological torment of constant competition and lack of autonomy. The bleak punchline of the Ottoman harem: a gilded cage is still a cage, no matter how many silk pillows it has. For all the exotic allure, the harem was fundamentally a system of control, a highly organized institution designed to perpetuate a dynasty and reinforce male power, often at the immense psychological and emotional cost of the women within its walls. The fantasy of boundless pleasure concealed a harsh reality of surveillance, brutal competition, and quiet despair, where the ultimate goal was not love or freedom, but bitter survival within a very beautiful, very suffocating prison. Alright, history fanatics. Tonight we're diving into a genuinely terrifying chapter, one that proves the greatest horrors aren't always committed by devils, but by those who truly believe they're doing God's work. We're going to dissect puritanical America and the infamous witch hunts. Because if you think it was just about old ladies flying on brooms, you've got another thing coming. This wasn't a spiritual crusade. It was a deeply unsettling, sexually repressed frenzy of fear, control, and misogyny, spiraling downward into bodily examinations, public shaming, and ultimately, murder. The absurdity of the witch hunts lies in their fervent, almost pathological, belief in invisible forces. In these stark, God-fearing communities, every misfortune, a sick cow, a bad harvest, a crying child, was attributed to the devil's influence, often operating through a human agent. And guess who was usually first in line for suspicion? Women, especially those who were independent, outspoken, elderly, or simply didn't conform to the rigid societal norms. The constant throb of paranoid fear created a climate where neighbor turned on neighbor, and accusations, however flimsy, could lead to a living nightmare. Let's get graphic with the bodily details, because the witch hunts involved a particularly nasty form of invasion. Accused witches were often subjected to hymenal inspections, or examinations for witch marks, or devil's teeth, supposed physical signs of their pact with Satan. These examinations were often conducted by groups of self-appointed experts, who would strip the accused naked, probe their bodies, and search for any unusual moles, birthmarks, or blemishes, which could then be interpreted as a sign of their demonic allegiance. Imagine the profound humiliation, the public exposure of one's body to strangers, the smear of degradation, all in the name of God. This was a grotesque violation, designed to break the spirit as much as to find evidence. The power games were utterly brutal. The accusers, often young girls or influential community members, wielded terrifying power. A mere whispered accusation, perhaps fueled by personal animosity, land disputes, or even perceived sexual slights, could condemn an innocent person. Those in authority, the magistrates, the ministers, often fanned the flames, convinced they were doing God's work by rooting out evil. This created an insidious feedback loop where confessions, often extracted under duress, torture, or the threat of further torment, validated the hunt, leading to more accusations, more trials, and more suffering. The constant pressure to conform, to confess, to name others, was a psychological torture all its own. The sexual undercurrent of the witch hunts was pervasive and deeply disturbing. The devil was often portrayed as a seducer, engaging in sexual acts with his witches. Accusations of carnal knowledge with Satan, or even orgies in the forest, were common themes in confessions. This highlights the profound sexual repression of the puritanical society, where any hint of female independence or sexuality, outside of strict marital bounds was seen as demonic. Women who defied societal norms, even subtly, were seen as dangerous. Their bodies and desires a direct threat to the established order. The filth they sought to uncover was often their own projected anxieties about lust and temptation. The emotional consequences were catastrophic. Accused witches faced public shaming, social ostracization, and the utter destruction of their lives and reputations. Families were torn apart. The constant fear of denunciation, the betrayal by neighbors and even family members, led to immense psychological trauma. For those who refused to confess, the trials were a slow, agonizing process, culminating in imprisonment, torture, and often death by hanging. The resolution for many was simply bitter survival, if they were lucky, or a public execution that served as a terrifying spectacle and a stark warning to others. The anatomical comedy here is darkly ironic. The meticulous, often ridiculous, examination of women's bodies for proof of witchcraft, turning natural blemishes into damning evidence, reducing complex individuals to mere physical aberrations. This was not about finding truth. It was about confirming preconceived notions, about seeing what they wanted to see. The entire process was a chilling theatrical performance, designed to reinforce community conformity and religious dogma. The language of the trials was rife with religious hypocrisy. Ministers preached charity and love, even as they condemned their neighbors to death, convinced they were battling Satan himself. The pursuit of spiritual purity became a justification for profound cruelty and exploitation. The moan of pain from the accused was often dismissed as the devil's influence, or proof of their guilt. The bleak punchline of the puritanical witch hunts? It wasn't about flying brooms. It was about human fear, deeply ingrained misogyny, and the terrifying power of unchecked religious fervor. The devils were often the people themselves, consumed by paranoia and a rigid belief system that justified unimaginable cruelty. The pursuit of purity, in this case, led to an astonishing amount of human suffering and a profound, indelible stain on America's history, a stark reminder that what people believe to be God's work can sometimes be the most horrifying of all. The constant societal pressure to conform, to remain silent, to suppress anything deemed deviant, choked out individual freedom and led to collective madness, leaving a lasting legacy of fear and shame.